Ok. Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Meu nome é Juan Céspedes. Trabalho para a Menicon como gerente de negocio para a América Latina. Em nome mío de Norma Cárdenas, como nossa gerenta técnica para a América Latina, gostaria de agradecer por sua presença e confiança nas lentes de contacto Rosca. También gostaríamos de agradecer a Mediphacos por la colaboración en la organización del evento único no Brasil. Antes de dar paso a Marcelo Suárez, eu gostaria de mostrar a vocês how you can, at the end of the webinar, you may have access to ask directly some questions to Dr. Paul Rose. And as you can see here on the screen, you can use this button, Q&A. So you can, during the presentation, the webinar, you can fill in your questions. Also, we offer the possibility to listen this webinar on Portuguese language or English. So here, if you go to the button interpretation, you can choose the language that you prefer to listen this webinar. And also at the end, during the webinar, we are going to put some information about Menicon about Roscape products here into the chat. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining tonight. And Marcelo, have a good evening. Thank you for your collaboration for prepare this webinar with Mr. Paul.
Olá, Juan, boa noite. Muito obrigada pela apresentação. É um prazer estar aqui com você e com nossos amigos da Menicon, né? Hoje é dia 18 de outubro, que no Brasil nós celebramos o Dia do Médico. Então, antes de começar, eu gostaria de expressar o nosso reconhecimento, admiração e gratidão a vocês médicos que desempenham um papel de fundamental importância e essencial em prol da saúde e da vida. Então, nossa homenagem, nosso muito obrigado. Hoje também é um dia muito especial, porque nós vamos ter o prazer de receber o Dr. Paul Rose, né, da Nova Zelândia, que é o criador das lentes de contato Rose K. E, sem dúvida, uma das pessoas que mais contribuíram, eu diria, a nível mundial, para a evolução das lentes de contato para côneas irregulares e também no treinamento de milhares de adaptadores no mundo inteiro. Dr. Rose tem uma didática excepcional e uma enorme generosidade para ensinar. Assim que ouvi-lo é sempre uma ótima oportunidade de aprendizado e atualização. Vamos ter hoje ainda dois convidados super especiais, né, que muito nos honram com suas presenças. Primeiro, a doutora Netana Schaefer, atual presidente da Soblec, vai estar conosco e vai fazer a apresentação do Dr. Paul Rose. E após a palestra do Dr. Rose, nós vamos ter o prazer de ouvir o Dr. Rodrigo Godinho, que vai complementar a palestra falando um pouco sobre a experiência dele com as lentes Rose K e também apresentar alguns estudos de caso, né? Então, antes de passar a doutora Tânia, somente dar novamente as boas-vindas e agradecer a presença de todos. Tânia.
Boa noite a todos, amigos. É um prazer muito grande estar aqui hoje, agradecendo ao Marcelo por ter escolhido essa data, uma data tão importante e que tem tudo a ver com a empresa que eu sempre digo, que é a empresa do oftalmologista brasileiro, que é a Mediphacos. E também por ter a honra de apresentar Paul Rose, que, como vocês todos sabem, quando a gente fala Paul Rose, a gente lembra de ceratocone, a gente lembra em reabilitação visual. Sem dúvida, Paul foi aquele profissional que começou a desenvolver a primeira lente Rose K na Nova Zelândia em 1987. E ele fez isso para ajudar um médico, os médicos adaptarem os seus pacientes de forma mais eficiente e eficaz. É importante nós salientarmos que este é o desenho mais adaptado em todo o mundo, em mais de 90 países, e atualmente é a marca mais prescrita do mundo. Isso nos traz um prazer muito grande aprender diretamente com o Paul aqui hoje e com esse apoio que a Menicon está nos dando para que todos tenham acesso a esse conhecimento. Muito obrigada a todos. Seja bem-vindo, Paul, Jennifer Chu. Obrigada, Juan Cesp, por trazer e a Norma também por estarem aqui conosco. Obrigada e, Paul, por favor, a palavra é sua.
I think, Paul, you can start. If you're ready.
Thank you. I will share my screen then and start my video.
Yeah.
Just a moment there,
Okay.
Juan.
Wonderful. Now we can see you. Perfect.
You can see me now?
Yes, and now, yeah, we can see your presentation.
All good?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not exactly sure what you said, but hopefully it was kind. Thank you for joining me. I'm in New Zealand here. It's about the middle of the day. We have a lovely spring day here. I'm sure the last thing you want to do after being a busy day in your office is spend time listening to me talking about my design. So I do appreciate you giving up the time to listen to what I've got to say about these two particular corneal designs today. Before I get started, I just want to talk about the importance of using the correct design for the condition you're fitting. So often I see practitioners pick up a lens and expect that lens to fit any type of condition. And that is the wrong approach, in my opinion, to take to fitting the irregular cornea. So for those that fit my designs, you'll know that if you have either of these two conditions, both cones, you're going to choose one of these two designs, either my original keratoconic design or the nipple cone design. But once you get these larger areas of distortion, typically these smaller corneal lenses don't locate well, they're unstable, and it's very, very difficult to get a very, very satisfactory result. So we have to go to either a larger diameter corneal lens, such as the Postcraft or the IC design. In saying that, my XL design which is my corneal scleral design, will fit any of these conditions, including cones, but it's not my first choice. I still like to use a corneal lens when I can. Just to explain a little bit further about design and the importance of design, if we look at some diagrams here, for early cones, you can get away with a rather large back optic area on a corneal lens. You end up with shallow pools, and you manage to get tear exchange from those pools quite adequately. But as the cone develops and steepens, if you try to use a large back optic area, these pools deepen, and the zone here, the bearing zone, gets very, very tight. Whereas if you use a very, very small back optic zone, you can eliminate these pools. This is schematic. And in fact, this lens, if we made a lens like this, it wouldn't move and would not be successful. So you need some slop in the system, but you don't want a large back optic on keratoconic designs. So how does that translate to fluorescent pictures? If we use a large back optic zone on a cone, it typically, if you look at this lens, which is a regular corneal lens, back optic zone occupies probably 70% of the back surface of the lens at least. And when you try to fit a keratoconic, what actually happens, you end up with these deep pools here, and you end up with a very, very tight peripheral system. This lens would likely bind to the cornea and you wouldn't get tear exchange. By then making it much smaller, that back optic zone, what we've done is reduce the seeing area, we've widened up the fitting area. This is obviously still too tight here, but you can see the difference in the optic area here and here between a keratoconic design and a non-keratoconic design. So that translates to a completely different fluorescent picture where we get a nice edge lift, as you can see here, and less pulling over this area. So we're going to ensure a good tear exchange. So we're going to talk specifically about the post-graft lens first. It's basically for post-graft corneas. So what types of surgery are we talking about? Obviously, corneal grafts, and it can be a full penetrating graft or a partial graft. LASIK and PRK, RK, which fortunately is not being done anymore, but we're still seeing the fallout from RKing that being done a couple of decades ago, and corneal ring inserts, which is certainly used still, I understand, in Brazil today. But typically, any of these surgeries often result in a flat oblate central area over the pupil, which means a keratoconic design or a normal lens design doesn't perform particularly well on them. So what happens if you try to fit a normal regular design corneal lens over a topography like this? You tend to end up with a very deep central pull. Over the bearing area here, you can see the graft edge here. We're still a little bit flat over this area here. We've got quite a lot of bearing, a little bit of standing showing up already here. So it's not a successful outcome, and you often get bubbles trapped within that central optic zone. So what the PG lens does is it doesn't use this design where you have a large steep central zone here. What we do is we flatten out the base curve, and then we use a reverse geometry to produce enough sagittal height for that cornea. So we minimize the height over the pupil, which is important for the vision and also for tear circulation. Do remember, with grafts, it's important when you fit grafts to look at them relatively regularly, because particularly in the early stage, in the first 2 years, they typically steepen up. I don't think I've ever seen a graft get flatter over the first 2 years. So you need to monitor the fit fairly closely, particularly over the first 2 years. The post-graft lens has reverse geometry in any base curves flatter than 7.4. You may say, why is it only 7.4? Because my whole feeling was that once you get to a 7.4 cornea shape, you've probably got a normal cornea, and you can probably use other designs. Increased amount of reverse geometry as the base curve flattens. So a 9.0 base curve is going to have significantly more reverse geometry than an 8.0 base curve. A large aspheric optic zone, which will cover the graft, and it has steeper peripheral curves than the KC lens. With the keratoconic lens, what you have is a very small back optic and very rapid flattening in the periphery. But this design doesn't have nearly as much flattening in the periphery. In other words, it has less axial edge lift. I've made the standard diameter 10.4, but I'll talk more about that. You do have a big range of diameter, and that is typically much larger than what you would use on a keratoconic design, which runs typically from about 8.7 to 9.1 as the most used diameters. So graphs, it's very hard to give you fluorescent pictures because no pictures, 2 pictures are the same, because the profiles on graphs are so different. So we often have a regular corneal profile, high degrees of often against the rule of astigmatism, it's often irregular. The graph can be any shape, it can be pronate or oblate, sunken or tilted, and it may not be centered over the pupil, as you can see here, which makes the fitting even more complicated. There's often raised scar tissue, particularly along or just inside the suture line here, which causes the lens to decentration. I made the 10.4 diameter, so we're actually going to fit outside the graft. So I did try originally to actually design something that fitted within the graft. That was highly unsuccessful and didn't work. So in my opinion, trying to fit a small lens on a graft doesn't work at all. The other thing you need to consider is the age and the type of the graft. If you're dealing with an old graft, then you've got to be very careful that you're not causing and compromising the health of that graft. So you need to understand how old the graft is if you can, and look at the endothelium. Do you have a normal endothelium count? Do you have any vessels? If you have any vessels that are coming in along the suture lines, you need to record those, understand where they are before you put a lens on that cornea. So corneal grafts, fits on corneal grafts are invariably a compromise. You never get the perfect fit, not like you can, I think, in keratoconus. Very difficult to get a perfect fit on grafts simply because the cornea is not even. It's not often symmetrical, which makes getting a perfect fit mostly impossible. But one little thing about these papers that I've quoted here, and these are quite old papers now, these were patients that were referred by optometrists to ophthalmologists for penetrating keratoplasties. We go back looking at those days, that's all that was offered in those days. The ophthalmologist looked at them and said, look, these corneas are relatively healthy. I don't believe that they require a graft yet. They referred them back to expert fitters, and this is the success rate that these fitters got achieved, up to 95% of patients that were referred for graft. In my opinion, grafts are much more difficult to fit than keratoconus, so please try an alternative before referring for a graft. You have many alternatives these days. So the primary indications are post-graft, post-LASIK, and rings, and a secondary indication of descended oval cones. I'll talk more about that. You have a comprehensive trial set of 22 lenses ranging in base curve from 6 to 9 millimeters, and you have a range of parameters about 0.3 flatter and steeper than that. You have a standard diameter for your trial set of 10.4, but a much larger range of diameters up to 12 millimeters and as small as 9.4. So you can order it in 0.1 steps. Initially, I signed what I call five standard lifts to alter the peripheral fitting of the lens. But in fact, I'll talk much more about this. I've had to extend that as people have pushed me to have more options in this design. For those that fit Rose K, you'll be aware of what I call my fitting system, which advocates 5 steps. So we look at the central fit first, we then address the peripheral fit, the diameter, the location, and finally the lens movement. So let's talk about that with the post-graft design, starting with the base curve or the central fit. You do have a guide which you can download, and it recommends the guide for post-graft going 0.3 steeper than the average K reading. This can only at best ever be a guide for your first lens. You have to interpret the fluorescent patterns, but at least it's a starting point. You'll also notice within the guide that post-LASIK patients, I recommend going 0.3 steeper than the mean K, but corneal rings, in fact, you actually use the keratoconic design for your first trial lens. The reason why, when you put rings into a cornea, you often don't get a huge amount of change in the central curvature. You get a uniformity over that pupil area, but often you only actually flatten it by 0.2 or 0.3, and you still often have a prolate shape. So starting off with the base curve, this is an ideal fit. What I'm trying to achieve is light feather touch over the highest point on the cornea. You can see the graft here. The highest point is just inside the graft here and here, and this is where I'm going to achieve my light feather touch. So if you're worried, is this light feather touch? If you go 0.1 steeper, you should basically see no touch. So we have this light feather touch. This is, in fact, is not touch. It's just that we don't have enough fluorescence to get fluorescence. There's still probably about 20 to 30 microns clearance at these 2 points on the cornea. So you can evaluate the base curve on when you first put it in, and then again, finally, after the lens has settled. So again, this is a 10.4 diameter lens. This is a very nice looking lens with nice edge lift and nice feather touch. This is an acceptable fit as long as you're not producing staining and the lens is stable. We've got some pooling here, but that's not what we can control with the post-graft. The highest point on the cornea controls the base curve selection. These are getting too steep now. This is a RK patient, and here again, it is too steep. Both of those were getting bubbles trapped centrally. These are obviously too flat. This lens would not be stable. In saying that, I took this picture of a patient that was wearing this lens quite successfully. So it staggers me, I'm sure you've all seen it, where a patient comes in with a very ill-fitting lens. The cornea looks healthy. You think, I can actually improve that. You try, and 6 months later, you realize the patient's no happier than they were when they first came in. So my rule of thumb there is, if you don't have a problem, the cornea looks healthy and the patient's happy, don't touch it. Just leave it alone and monitor the eye health. Obviously, flat here and here, this is much more than we've got feather touch there. Here you can see a little bit more than feather touch up in this inferior, and what's happening, the lead is pushing on here. This is acting as a fulcrum, and it's causing the bottom of the lens to ride off. So this lens is probably about 0.12 flat. Here's a typical toric against the graft, against the raw graft. So our steepest meridian is in the horizontal, and our flattest meridian is in the vertical. This again was a patient very successfully wearing this lens, and my immediate reaction is, gee, should I change this? But they weren't having any problems. They were getting good acuity. Was it satisfactory? I didn't touch it. The reason it's satisfactory is the toricity is over the graft itself. Outside the graft, we don't actually see any toricity. And what tends to control the fit in these designs is what happens in that outer area, more so than what happens over the graft. So here I did nothing. I still left the patient like that. And last time I saw them several years ago, they were still wearing that lens quite happily. In this case, however, though, the against the rule astigmatism is causing the lens to descend down and impact into the limbus. So we're going to have to do something about this. My first option here would be to use what we call a toric periphery. Toric periphery is where the central base optic zone, which is around 7 to 8 millimeters, stays untouched. And we just put toric curves at the extreme, about the last 1 to 1.5 millimeters of the lens. So what we do in this case is you would flatten it here and you would steepen it here. So this for me is not going to be successful without going to a toric back surface, a full back surface, or to a toric periphery. And toric peripheries are much easier to fit than full back surface torics. Here's one fitted over corneal rings, although in corneal rings, as you can see, this is only a single corneal ring. The main point here is do not leave any significant touch over the ring. If you do, you will find you'll get staining and the lens will be uncomfortable. The lens is locating well, it has lovely edge lift, large back optic area. That would be a very successful fit on that ring patient. So moving to the peripheral fit, and what I'm going to be talking now is what's happening at the edge of the lens. So when you change the edge lift on my designs, all the curves from the back optic area out to the edge of the lens will actually change. Even though we're only going to interpret the change in the last millimeter of the lens, the curves right back to the back optic zone area all change. So I offered, as I mentioned, 5 standard edge lifts initially, with my post-graft design being standard, which is most of the trial sets are, +1, which means you're increasing the lift, +2, which means you're double increasing the lift, or -1 or 2, where you're decreasing the lift, you're tightening the fit. Exactly the same system as offered with my normal keratoconic designs. I offered in 0.5 steps. I didn't feel we need the sensitivity in 0.1 steps that we needed with the keratoconic design. However, over the years, I've been pushed more and more, and I've had to extend the options available right down to -3 decrease. That's a very, very tight edge, to a +7 increase, which is a very, very open edge lift. So you have 19 edge lift options. In saying that, probably around 70% of grafts or of regular corneas, when you're using this design, fall into one of these 5 edge lifts. So not often you have to go to the extremes that I offer there. So what we're trying to achieve is a nice fluorescent band, as you see here. This is perfect, something between 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters wide. It's a little bit more open here. Being a little bit more open inferiorly, as long as you're not getting bubbles, is not going to cause us problems at all. So this is absolutely ideal. This is getting now a little bit too open. You can see here, this is definitely more than 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters. This is probably over 1 millimeter. And we're starting to see little bubbles into the edge of the lens. So we're going to need to order a decreased lift in a case like this. Here, both these show a very, very tight periphery. You can see here, very little fluorescent band here. And when you see this dark area like you see at the edge of the lens, you know that the edge is much too tight. So here, in both these cases, you would order a +1 to open up that edge lift. That will make the lens center better. It will help tear exchange and be much more comfortable for the patient. Moving to diameter, what we're trying to do is obviously use a diameter that gives us good location. You can see the edge of the graph just here, even though this is against the rule of astigmatism here. You're looking to have a width between the edge of the lens and the limbus of about 0.7 to about 1 millimeter. So we're still well clear inside the limbus. Here again, a nice edge lift, nice feather touch. This is an ideal diameter in both those cases. So here we show large diameters where in fact the lens is impacting heavily into the limbus. This would not be comfortable, and it's obviously the edge is much too tight here. And again here, this is taking up the whole cornea. This was an 11.2 diameter lens that was used on a small cornea. This is not going to be comfortable. The lens is going to bind. It's not going to move. We need to steepen the base curve. We need to reduce the diameter, and we need to open up the periphery. So what diameter we use? We try to use a minimum diameter that results in good centration, movement, and stability. So don't go any bigger than you have to go. Here is a case of a small, you can see the edge of the graft here. This is actually fitted within the graft. It's about the same size as the graft. Would not be successful, would be very unstable. So location, often with grafts, it's very difficult to get good location because the lens wants to center out to the highest point, which is often somewhere along the graft host interface, as you see here. So obviously we're trying to get the lens to locate centrally over the pupil and not impinge onto the limbus, as you see here. So how can you fix this? Let's look at the left picture for a start. In some cases, going larger and steeper, I would certainly try a slightly steeper lens here, can help. Increasing the edge lift can also help in some cases. This has a tight edge lift. If you have a tight edge lift, you don't get often good location. You need to open up. If you're in doubt, you're better to have more edge lift than less edge lift. Here we see a lens. You think that's looking pretty good in the straight ahead position, but as soon as the patient looks laterally, the lens moves off the cornea. So here, obviously, we can see the size of the graft. This lens is much too small. I talked about using the post-graft design on large, low oval cones. You can see here, the apex of the cones is very inferior, and it's a large type of cone. It's not pellucid because we don't have a tight area here and here. With pellucid, because the steepening is so inferior, we have a relatively normal cornea below these cones. If I tried to fit a smaller diameter lens on this left picture, I would end up with the lens locating quite low, which is not going to work out at all. While using a larger back optic area, I can encompass this height area in the optic area of the lens without the lens having to descend down. So this is why the more the cone is away from the apex or from the center of the cornea, the more you have to thinking about going bigger with the diameter. The bigger you go with the diameter with my designs, the bigger the back optic zone automatically becomes. So you've got to take into, if you're going to ever use the PG lens on an oval cone, typically it would only be used for very, very low oval cones. Finally, lens movement, what we're trying to achieve is a 1 to 1.5 millimeter, so that ensures tear exchange. Here you can see the lens is a little bit flat up here, which is causing lift off at the bottom. We're not getting any bubbling though, so this would in fact work out quite well. We do have very, very nice edge lift here. I'll just play that video again. You can see the edge lift here is absolutely perfect. But now that little bubble you saw is not impacting up in here. That still would work out quite well. So to decrease the movement, you're going to have to make the edge lift less. You're going to steepen the base curve or make the diameter bigger. And exactly the reverse if you want to increase the movement. Here we have nice movement, nice edge lift. Here is the cone. It's very, very inferior. It's with a post-graft design, and it has 3.5 Dopplers of cylinder on the front. This laser mark indicates roughly the 6 o'clock position. And you can see here it's not moving much at all. So again, this patient was very, very happy with the outcome using a post-graft design, incorporating that large degree of cylinder. Here, I was going to end up the post-graft design talking about 3 different case histories. So this is the first one, and it's one of these cases where very difficult to get a good fitting. You've got a large pull over the central area. We're still flat here. We need to actually steepen the base curve to improve this, but that's going to make the central area even worse. So sometimes in the past, when I've really got stuck and I don't want to use a scleral lens or a corneal scleral lens, I will use a disposable lens of a plus power to fill out this area, and then I'll fit over the top of it. So in this case, I used a plus 350 disposable lens, daily disposable lens, and this was the pattern. You can see the disposable lens, it's completely taken out that central pulling area. So just think that not often that you'd have to use it, but if you really get stuck, you can't get rid of that pulling centrally and particularly bubbling, do think about using a plus disposable lens to actually change the profile that you're fitting. Dimple veiling or bubbling, as you can see here in this case, the left case, we're not getting much over the pupil, so it's unlikely to cause any problems. Dimple veiling doesn't actually cause any long-term problems for the cornea, and in this case, I wouldn't bother to change the fit. However, in this case, that is going to reduce your vision by at least 2 or 3 lines. You can't leave it. So how are you going to fix it? You can flatten the base curve. Yes, I think we could flatten the base curve here by at least 0.1. You can increase the edge lift. You might think that's wrong, that you should decrease it. But typically, if the edge lift is too tight, when bubbles are introduced, they don't get out. They stay trapped in the optic area. So typically, you have to actually increase the edge lift, make the lens smaller. If you make it smaller, you reduce the back optic zone, which helps reduce the bubbling. And you do have what we call ACT or quadrant specific edge lift options. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. So here's case history 2, and this was a post-grafted toric lens that I fitted directly onto a graft. No matter what I did, and I used a back surface toric, the lens tended to center nasally like this, didn't get good wearing time, and the patient wasn't particularly happy with the comfort. We had 13, just going back there, you can see here the topography, we've got 13 Dopplers of astigmatism, a regular astigmatism, so a real challenge to fit. What I decided to do is rather than fit a full back surface toric, I would fit a toric periphery only, and I'd use a plus 350 to change the profile of the cornea I was fitting. So this is a picture of the lens with the toric full back surface, no piggybacking. And here's the new lens piggybacked over a plus 350 Oasis. And you can see here we've got a much more centralized lens, and it ended up being a very good result. So what did I learn in that? Full back surface torics do not usually work well on toric grafts. It's very difficult to often get a good stable result. Toric periphery lenses are often more successful than full back surface torics. And if you're really stuck and you need to change the profile of that cornea, think about using a plus lens, and you can try different powers to work out the minimum plus power you require to get better centration and fit. The final case history I want to talk about talks about vision. This was a patient who had post-LASIK and started to get ectasia. I tried to fit the post-graft directly onto it here. I've got nice feather touch here, pulling here. This is the XL design. This is my 14.6 millimeter corneal scleral design. Again, we've got touch here. We've got quite a deep pull here. So in both those cases, I didn't get vision better than 618. And because of that deep pull, I just couldn't get the vision up. So what I did, I fitted a +6 soft lens underneath here. You can see the edge of the soft lens here. And even though that looks flat, it doesn't matter simply because we're not touching the back surface of the lens on the cornea. We have the buffer of the soft lens in between, and lo and behold, the vision improved from 618 up to 6.9. So that was just a lesson for me that sometimes when you get very deep pulls here, it does affect the vision. By going flatter, as we did here, we improved the vision quite dramatically. So as Juan mentioned, it is available on the website, www.rosekalens.com, and you have the video fitting guides there, and included in that is the post-graft fitting guide. Okay, now to the IC lens. So how is the IC lens different to the post-graft design? So IC stands for irregular cornea, and its primary indications are early pellucid, globus, and LASIK-induced ectasia. Pellucid, difficult condition to fit, as is globus, unless it's very early. Typically, you've got to go to a semi-scleral or a scleral lens to fit these conditions once they become moderate to advanced. Secondary indications, again, as I described before, larger centered oval cones or corneal grafts where you can't get stability with the 10.4 diameter post-graft design. So how does it vary from the post-graft design? The major differences are the standard larger diameter of 11.2 or 11.4 and slightly tighter peripheral curves, so it has a little bit less axial edge lift than the post-graft design. The trial set is 18 lenses, but again, you have a big range of base curves outside of the trial set, going as steep as 5.7 and as flat as 9.3. Depending on what part of the world you are, it depends on whether you go for the 11.2 or 11.4. Typically, countries where you have large corneas, as you probably do in Brazil and certainly in Italy, the 11.4 will be standard, but in countries like Japan, where the corneas are smaller, you would choose the smaller 11.2 millimeter design lens trial set. Again, I offered 5 edge lifts, as you can see here, and I'll talk more about that as we go through. But again, I needed to extend the range, the same as the post-graft design. You have a very, very large range of options from -3 decrease, that's tightening the fit, to +7 increase, where you're loosening that peripheral fit. I'm not going to go through these one. I covered it well in the post-graft, so I'm just going to look at some fluorescent patterns and comment on these particular aspects of these patterns. So here's the first one. You can see here we have a low cone here. So they've used the IC lens, which is occupying nearly the whole cornea. Still looks good. We have lovely lift off at the edge of the hair, which is going to ensure good tear exchange. That would work extremely well. Here, I don't think we need any medals for choosing this one. These are both extremely flat centrally to such a degree that we can see lift off. That lens is not going to locate and is going to be very unstable on blinking. So I'd ask you to comment quickly on looking at the main problem of this IC fit. I'm going to put the answer up in a moment, but this is the highest point on this cornea. Here's the graft. You can see the edge of the graft here. You can see we have feather touch here. So how would you improve that fit? The main problem here is we've got a very tight peripheral fit here and here, which means we do have some symmetry. So my first option there would be go to the toric periphery design, because basically within the graft, you're not going to change the fit. You're only going to change the fit outside of the graft. What a toric periphery will do is open up the edge lift here and here, and it will close it down here and here. Looking at this, I can assure you that once we do that, we're going to also have to increase the edge lift overall. So we'd want to increase the edge lift as well as using a toric periphery in that case. Here's another one. What are the main problems with this fit? We're still flat on our base curve. With that much impact, you're going to get problems with corneal staining. Remember that as you steepen the base curve, the periphery will steepen and that will close the edge lift down. So you can't judge the correct edge lift until you got the base curve correct. So you can't look at this and say, okay, I'm going to go 0.2 steeper and I'm going to go tighter in my edge lift. Because once you go 0.2 steeper, you may not need to change your edge lift. So just a word of warning, make sure you've got the right base curve before you address the edge fitting. What about this one? The main problem here is that we are flat here. So this is causing the lens to, the lid's pushing down here. It is causing the lens to lift off here. But also once we go steeper, we're going to tighten up that fit even further, which is not going to work. It's already tight here. We're going to need to go to a probably 0.2 steeper base curve and an increased lift in our periphery. This lens was being worn very successfully, this IC lens. I took this picture, the patient was very happy with the result, even though it's not a perfect fit. And I mentioned it's very difficult to get perfect fits on these corneas because there's so much asymmetry. It's a bit tight here and here, a little bit open here and here, but overall the patient was happy, the vision was good. I didn't change it. But if I did change it, what would I do? Would I steepen the base curve? Maybe. I really don't think so. Edge lift, if I increase the edge lift around the clock, that's going to improve it here. It's going to make it too open here and here. The diameter, a little bit big, it's impacting. It would be my first choice, making a smaller lens in that case. If this was an 11.4, I would think of reducing it by about 0.5 millimeters to around about a 10.9. There is the option of quadrant-specific edge lifts with these designs where you can say, okay, I'm happy with the edge lift here and here, but I want to increase the edge lift here at about 2 o'clock and here also. So you can dial up, as long as the quadrants are 90 degrees apart, you can dial up and order different amounts of edge lifts in 4 different quadrants. Do remember, however, that the lens is stabilized by prism ballast, which in some cases causes the lens to locate a little bit lower, which can create other problems. So you don't use quadrant-specific edge lifts unless you really need to. Here's a Rosca IC on this patient here. How could we improve the fit? Immediately you can see here, have we got feather touch? Maybe we are a little bit steep. Could we go 0.1 flatter? I think we could. We have symmetry here with the lens being tight here and here. Difficult to see what's happening above the lid, but this is enough symmetry to use a toric periphery. ACT is the design where you can just tuck the bottom of the lens in. So if you decided that everything about this fit was fine, except that you had lift-off inferiorly, all you'd order is ACT. The lab can describe to you the different options you have, the levels of ACT, and all that happens then is the lens is tucked in here to reduce the lift-off inferiorly. Or you could use quadrant-specific edge lift, but in this case, I don't believe that would be applicable. So here's an IC lens on an RK patient, definitely flat over that highest point. Periphery, yep, looks pretty good generally around, although we do have these tight areas. There's no way we can actually get around that. But typically your tightest area controls the edge lift that you choose. So you're better to be more open in some areas than have it too tight in other areas. Here's the IC lens on an oblique astigmatic corneal graft. This patient again was wearing this lens quite happily. I did not bother to change the fit, even though the fit is not absolutely ideal. Still, we got a good result with good tear exchange. Here's an IC on a post graft with a relaxing incision cut here. How could we improve it? I think the base curve's too steep. That here. The periphery is definitely too tight. You can see these little black areas here and here, and we don't have that nice 0.6 to 0.8 band of fluorescence. Also, the bubble indicates that the periphery is too tight. I mentioned that if your periphery is too tight, you can get bubbles trapped within that central area. So what can I do? I would flatten the base curve, then I'd readdress what's happening. And by flattening the base curve, who knows? The periphery might then look good, or maybe you have to flatten it a little bit further. The diameter, not too bad. I don't think the diameter, even though it's bearing down here, a tight edge lift will cause the lens to ride lower. So once you open up that edge lift, the lens is going to ride higher. Here is a IC lens on a decentered cone. The blacker this area is, the more you have to change the edge lifts. This is grossly tight. This would, in fact, adhere to the cornea without doubt. So this is not going to work. You would have to order at least a +2 increased lift to open up that peripheral fit. Here we have a case of a bubble showing here. How could we eliminate the bubble? Could we flatten the base curve? Yes, I think we could probably go 0.1 flatter here. Could we increase the edge lift? Absolutely. This is too tight here. This fluorescent here is on the front surface of the lens. This is not underneath the lens. This is the true picture you're seeing here. So definitely, we're definitely too tight in the periphery. If that didn't work out, we could look at changing the design to a keratoconic design. This looks like to me a large, probably a large oval cone. Here, descented cone. So the biggest issue we have here that I can see is we are too tight in the periphery. And typically on cones, if you're going to use the PG lens on cones, on descended oval cones, you very frequently have to open up the periphery. The standard 0 edge lift is not sufficient. This was the case in New Zealand, was sent to me by a New Zealand practitioner who fitted IC directly onto the eye. You can see here, it's not decentering at all, not a good fit here. They decided just to put a +1 Premio underneath it and piggyback it over and got a very successful fit. And the patient was comfortable up to 8 hours a day wearing that combination. So again, just a reminder, if anything else fails, a piggyback, if you don't want to go to a scleral or semi-scleral design, piggyback is certainly still an option. This is what we never want to see. And this was in fact a person from fitted in the US with a scleral lens that visited my practice. She was traveling through New Zealand. She'd only had the scleral lens about 9 months. And this is what I saw. She came in because she was having problem tolerating the lens and getting foggy vision at the end of the day. A poor fitting lens, but again, with grafts, you're going to fit a graft. My first option is a corneal lens if it's going to locate and be successful. Grafts, you've got to be so careful with. You've got to monitor them carefully if you're going to go to a larger semi-scleral or scleral lens design. And always use high material, DK materials like Menicon Z, for example. I want to finish this lecture by just quickly talking about endothelium before we move off and go to question time. At birth, we are born with about 5,000 cells per square millimeter, but we lose these progressively. So by the age of 40, it's dropped to about 3,000. So what's the average normal cell count per square millimeter for a normal health cornea? It's around 2,000 to 3,200 and would look like this. So do have a look at your grafts. Are they old? Are you putting the grafts at risk? The older the grafts, the more polymegalism we have on the back surface here and the endothelial cells, and the lower the count, the more careful you have to be. Here's a study done relatively recently in in Saudi Arabia, and the findings that at baseline 10 days post-surgery, these were full penetrating grafts, the endothelial cell density was nearly 2,400, with not a big range over there. But after 5 years, it had dropped down to 1,035 as the average. So there had been a 56% loss of endothelial cells. So again, to say the older the graft, the more conservative you have to be about your approach. And here's another study. This was a study that was done 15 years after PK, after full penetrating keratoplasty, that showed the annual rate of endothelial loss to be nearly 8% a year in the first 5 years and around 4% in the second 10 years, which meant a 10-year cumulative risk of developing glaucoma, graft rejection, graft failure was around 21%. So again, I just emphasize the importance of trying to use a corneal lens if you can. It's not always successful, and you are forced to use larger diameter lenses, but corneal lenses are tried and true on grafts, and if you can get them to fit and locate well, it's my first option. So just that word of warning, is it safe to reduce oxygen levels to these already compromised cornea with lower endothelial counts? I just see fitters not even bothered to look at endothelials when they take my lens and fit grafts. I think a word of warning there, you must. So I haven't got time today to talk about the advanced options. The laboratory can, I have touched on them, but the laboratory can help you. Mediphacos can help you. You have toric periphery quadrant-specific edge lifts, ACT where you tuck in 1 or 2 quadrants, front surface torics if you've got residual cylinder, full-back surface torics, that's a lecture in itself, and simultaneous bifocal design where you are presented with a central or a central near or distant center. Again, that's described in the fitting guide. So what are the most common reasons that I see for failure? Not choosing the right design from the first stage, not using enough edge lift, and usually with grafts it's not enough, ignored corneal astigmatism, which is affecting the location of the lens, reluctance to vary the diameter away from the trial lens, or reluctance to use larger semi-scleral or corneal scleral designs when everything else fails. So to finish up, I'm going to show you 2 slides that were sent to me by fitters around the world. We look at this and we think, gosh, that is a terrible fit. The diameter is much too big. The base curve's steep. We've got a gross bubble and the edge lip was grossly tight. This practitioner had bought a 11.4 IC set, followed the fitting guide, and this was his first trial lens. And he came to me and he said, Paul, this is not a particularly ideal fit. What am I doing wrong? I said, please send me your topography. What did he have? He had a relatively early oval cone, oval to moderate oval cone. He should not have used the IC design on this. This was not the first choice. He should have used the keratoconic design. So by nature, no matter what he did to the IC design there, it would have resulted in failure. And again, this was a picture sent to me. Practitioner had got the IC set, followed the fitting guide and said, what do I think of this fitting? I asked him to send me the map. And if you look here, he has achieved feather touch over the central area. It looks like we have a cone here and absolutely confirmed by here. What do we have? We had nipple cone. So he had used the largest diameter lens with the least amount of flattening in the periphery, with the biggest back optic zone, for a design where he should have used the smallest back optic zone with the most amount of peripheral flattening. So please take time to make sure you understand the shape of the cornea you are fitting before you leap in and use either the PG or the NC design, sorry, the PG or the IC design for the irregular cornea. And finally, this one here, a very, very early oval cone. This practitioner, because it was descented, decided to use a post-graft design. They have achieved a light feather touch here at the apex of the cone. The periphery is much too tight, causing the lens to locate down, and this would not move very much. Looking at the map, I think a much better option would be staying with the keratoconic design and going with a larger diameter, like sort of 9.8 or 10 millimeters. He would have achieved a much better fit, both in that periphery and in both in the location. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't gone on too much there. My sincere thanks to Menicon and Mediphacos for putting this seminar together. And it's back to you. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this great webinar. I'm going to let Marcelo Suarez to introduce Dr. Godinho, that I heard it is raining a lot in Belo Horizonte.
Thank you very much, Juan. And Paul, let me take a moment to thank you for your fantastic presentation. It is always a great pleasure to listen to your talks. We learn so much each time. And it's really fantastic how you have expanded the family of designs on Rose-K, which allow us to fit otherwise very challenging cases, such as post-graft and post other kinds of corneal surgery. And I believe that the fact that 25 years on, Rose-K remains the most prescribed lens for irregular cornea in the world is the best proof of the Rose-K safety and efficacy. So congratulations and thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thanks,
Bom,
Marcelo.
vamos dar então seguimento. Yeah?
Marcelo, un minuto. Before to introduce Dr. Godinho, I think that we have some questions from doctors to Paul Rose and Patricia. Yeah, great.
Yes. Okay. Can you see my screen right now?
Wonderful.
Excellent. So, well done, Paul. Thank you very much for your lecture. All the time I learn from you. So we have 3 questions from the people in Brazil. Thank you all for enjoying to this webinar. The first question from Adriana. Can I try all the corneal lens design rose case before think to use scleral contact lenses?
Thank you for the question, Adriana. My answer is, we know that corneal lenses have been tried and proved as the safest design, safer than soft lenses, certainly safer than semi-sclerals or scleral lens designs. They've been around for years. So if I can get a successful fit with a corneal lens design on a post graft, I would always do that before moving to my XL design or a larger semi-scleral design. So the answer is yes, I would try to get it right. It's not always possible, but it is, for the long-term health of the graft, the best option in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Second question from Leonardo. For graft patient, if I use the piggy banking over a soft contact lenses, will this reduce the oxygen transmission and put graft at risk?
Yes, the answer is yes, you will reduce the oxygen transmission available to the cornea. I haven't had a chance to go into the fitting of piggybacks today. The biggest problem that you get is if the rigid lens binds to the soft lens, you reduce the oxygen availability dramatically. So it's very, very important that you keep that rigid lens moving over the front of that soft lens to maximize tear exchange, which means you often have to fit it flatter with a little bit more open in the edge lift to ensure that the 2 lenses don't bind. If the 2 lenses don't bind, then you use a daily silicon hydrogel lens. Usually you can get 8 hours wear without putting the graft at risk, depending on the age of the graft, of course, but again, monitor it very closely.
Thank you very much, Paul. This kind of patient with graft, absolutely, they are the most complicated patient in the regular cornea. So the last question from Rodrigo. If you cannot fit PG lens, do you recommend try a piggyback system first before try scleral contact lenses? This is similar to the first question we made before. So if do you want to complementary another information about that?
It's an interesting question, and I don't honestly have a direct answer for you because each case you have to look at on its merits. For example, why didn't the post graft fit? Do we have a new graft? Do we have an old graft? Is the endothelial count good? Personally, with XL design, which is a corneal scleral design where you get quite a bit of tear exchange, I'm comfortable going, if I cannot get a corneal lens to fit. Patients typically don't like piggyback systems with 2 lenses, so I will try the XL lens in preference to going to a piggyback. So if I can't get the PG lens to fit, I would probably go to my XL design before I went to a piggyback system.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. We don't have more questions, Juan.
At this moment, well, there is a question from Danilo that he's asking for how to use the fluorescein on piggyback.
So you can use high molecular fluorescein because if you get fluorescein behind the soft lens, it's impossible to tell the relationship between the soft lens and the hard lens. So what I do, Juan, is I take out the rigid lens, put a very small amount of high molecular fluorescein in the lens, put it over the soft lens, and immediately look at the fit. You get a couple of blinks, and you get probably 10 seconds, 20 seconds where you get a very good idea of what's going on. After the fluorescein dissipates outside and goes under the soft lens, very hard to tell what's happening. But yes, you can even use low molecular fluorescent. If you use a small amount and you do it very quickly, you still get quite a good idea. But typically, ideally, if you have high molecular fluorescent, that's my preference.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul. So, Marcelo, may you introduce, please, the next lecturer,
Yes,
Rodrigo?
Sure, Juan. Bem, nós vamos então dar seguimento ao webinar, né, com a presença importante do Dr. Rodrigo Godinho, de Belo Horizonte, que é um profissional com uma das maiores experiências na adaptação de lentes Rosicá no Brasil. E o Dr. Rodrigo vai compartilhar conosco um estudo de casos para falar um pouco da experiência dele com esse tipo de lente. Então, agradecendo a presença do Rodrigo, é a sua palavra.
Obrigado.
Eu agradeço aí as palavras do Marcelo. Queria agradecer, obviamente, em primeiro lugar, a Menicon, que, de fato, na figura do Juan Sérgio, um grande amigo, né? A Norma Cárdenas também, Patrícia Flores, uma adorável amiga que está aqui, muito bom sempre dividir esse espaço com ela, Jenny Queixou. Mediphacos, eu agradeço na figura do Marcelo Soares também, essa grande empresa parceira da contatologia médica no Brasil, até por nos trazer sempre esses produtos novos. A Tânia, nossa presidente, que está aqui também, essa grande guerreira da contatologia médica. E, obviamente, uma honra muito grande poder estar aqui dividindo esse espaço com o professor Paul Rose, a quem a gente agradece sempre muito pelo desenvolvimento desse produto fantástico que a gente tem na contatologia, que revolucionou a adaptação de lente de contato, de maneira que a gente consegue hoje abordar casos que antigamente eram muito desafiadores e com muita facilidade, com muita praticidade. Então, de fato, muito obrigado. Vou aqui agora dividir a minha tela com vocês. Parece que não está habilitado aqui para eu poder dividir a minha tela.
Ok. Déjame ver cómo puedo habilitar.
At the very bottom of your screen, Doctor, there's a little green arrow. Just click on share screen.
Tá desabilitado aqui para mim o compartilhamento, okay. Provavelmente.
Eu habilitei, Dr. Godinho. Você pode provar agora?
Tá tudo certo.
Okay.
Acho que vocês estão já assistindo aí. Acredito que o meu slide já está aparecendo. Bom, enfim, fui convidado para apresentar esse estudo de caso, com essa lente que, de fato, revolucionária, que eu gosto muito, faz parte do meu dia a dia no meu consultório e, de fato, né, proporcionando uma qualidade visual muito superior, uma adaptação muito confortável, muito respeitosa, respeitando sempre a fisiologia, isso é o que a gente mais preza, né? E trago aqui para vocês esse caso clínico, que traz, obviamente, também muita reflexão, e também para reforçar um pouco de tudo que o professor Paul Rose falou, né, a respeito dessa lente magnífica. Um paciente de 29 anos, masculino, portador de ceratocone. Esse paciente era paciente do nosso serviço alguns anos atrás, era usuário de um ceratocone inicial, usuário de uma lente asférica. A gente viu aí, o Paul Rose falou muito bem a respeito da qualidade visual, o ganho de qualidade visual com a adaptação das lentes Rosicá, mas a gente sabe também por questão, às vezes, de um custo, alguma coisa nesse sentido, você faz uma opção, às vezes, por uma lente monocurva, o paciente tem uma boa visão, se adapta bem, principalmente paciente jovem, mas o caso desse paciente era isso, em 2014, era um paciente com uma refração de menos 4,75, um astigmatismo de menos 4 no olho direito, a visão de 20,25 com essa correção, olho esquerdo um pouco menor, uma visão de 20,20, ceratocone de fato inicial, usuário de uma lente asférica de curvatura 44, né? Nós não temos o vídeo porque o interessante foi o que aconteceu com ele na sequência. Esse paciente mudou de plano de saúde em 2016, passou aos cuidados de outro colega, né, que indicou o anel. Vimos aí o professor também falar um pouco sobre essas abordagens cirúrgicas que às vezes podem trazer de fato um resultado insatisfatório. O paciente que enxergava muito bem com uma lente simples agora está extremamente infeliz, né? Foi indicado para ele lente escleral. Esse paciente voltou ao nosso departamento um pouco irritado, né, em consulta particular, ou seja, também abriu mão da consulta do convênio. Eu destaco, obviamente, nesse slide, essa indicação de lente escleral precoce, ou seja, quando a gente aborda esses casos de indicação de lente escleral, muitas vezes, você colhendo um pouco melhor a história do paciente, você vê que em momento algum foi abordado para ele essa lente corneal, que de fato muito mais respeitosa e segura, é a adaptação médica, né? Então, nós temos esse comparativo no quadro de 2014 para 2018, né? Um paciente era satisfeito com uma adaptação de baixo custo, e em 2018 ele voltou insatisfeito. Um detalhe interessante, esse paciente queria um relatório para judicialização contra o colega, né? De uma lente, adaptação de uma lente escleral, insatisfeito também com o custo da adaptação que foi passado para ele posterior à cirurgia. A gente avaliando a topografia desse paciente, a gente nota que no início, em 2014, ele tinha, de fato, um cone incipiente, uma adaptação, mesmo que tivesse alguma queixa visual de uma rosicá, com uma previsibilidade de adaptação muito tranquila, uma lente com uma probabilidade de centralização muito boa, uma lente que permitisse a ele um bom respeito. Ele retorna em 2018 com essa irregularidade muito ampla. De fato, a córnea irregular ela foge um pouco do padrão da adaptação. A gente sabe que a gente tem um pouco mais de dificuldade, né? A gente sempre segue a regra, como o professor Rose falou, de quanto maior e mais centrada for essa irregularidade, né? Maior a chance da gente ter que adaptar uma lente de diâmetro maior, para que a gente possa recobrir tanto a equitasia quanto o eixo visual, permitindo um bom conforto visual. E quando a gente faz a biomicroscopia desse paciente, a gente vê o anel no olho esquerdo, uma inserção um pouco centralizada também, né? Já com a expectativa de uma adaptação também com dificuldade de centralização, né? A visão ainda que com a lente de contato, alguma expectativa de queixa visual, de qualidade visual pela essa localização do arco do anel. Realmente não foi uma cirurgia bem sucedida, como a gente costuma ver aí de vez em quando, em alguns casos de anel. E quando a gente parte para essa avaliação, avaliando a topografia, lembrando que o ceratocone, de fato, tem regras muito eficazes para a escolha da curva base da lente de teste, mas quando a gente vai para essas dicas de adaptações em córneas irregulares, a gente sabe que a gente tem um forte apelo para a prática de tentativa e erro, né? A gente não tem uma regra totalmente eficaz da escolha da curva base da lente de teste, a gente avalia o padrão topográfico para que ele nos dê uma noção e nos ajude a interpretar aquela adaptação, principalmente o padrão fluoresceínico. E vale sempre lembrar que quanto maior e mais descentrada for a irregularidade, maior o diâmetro da lente de contato de teste, né? E a gente nunca perder essa sequência, como o professor Rose também reforçou muito bem, né? As lentes corneanas, para depois pensar nas córneas esclerais, depois pensar em piggyback, lentes esclerais. Vai parecer, inclusive, que combinamos a nossa conduta, que de fato não foi. Fiquei muito feliz de saber também que eu sigo uma conduta muito parecida com quem estudou tanto essas lentes e pensa muito na saúde ocular em primeiro lugar. Outra coisa de dica de córneas irregulares é a gente entender que córneas irregulares a gente vai ter sempre um padrão de adaptação irregular, então nunca ficar buscando aquele padrão perfeito de livro, né? Aquelas figuras de adaptação em córneas regulares, né? O que a gente busca de ideal é proporcionar troca lacrimal, evitar, obviamente, um toque excessivo, sempre que de vez em quando a gente encontra um desafio nessa modificação para aliviar um toque, a gente deve sempre avaliar essa tolerância, né? A gente tem uma limitação na avaliação de um filme lacrimal, a gente sabe que uma espessura inferior a 25 micras, muitas vezes você não vê fluoresceína, o que não significa obrigatoriamente um toque. Então, sempre avaliar essa tolerância, evitar os acúmulos excessivos, porque pode gerar esse desconforto visual com a presença de bolhas, e lembrar que tem sempre que recobrir eixo visual. Não adianta eu ter uma adaptação fisiológica, bonita, maravilhosa, se eu não estou dando visão a esse paciente. Então, a gente faz a avaliação da centralização. Numa córnea irregular, a gente sabe que a gente tem um caso desafiador, então, quanto mais eu tiver formas de combinar parâmetros diferentes na lente, num processo de personalização da adaptação para cada olho de questão, maior a minha chance de ter, de fato, sucesso nessa adaptação. Então, quando a gente olha esse quadro da rosicá, ainda falta aqui a rosicá IC, que seria a córnea escleral, mas a gente vê a possibilidade que a gente tem de combinar diversos parâmetros. Aqui eu destaco os principais, né? Mas com as lentes rosicás eu escolho a minha curva base. Diante disso, eu consigo combinar ela com um diâmetro diferenciado, uma curva periférica também diferenciada, variando a sua elevação ou mesmo a sua redução, o seu rebaixamento. A tecnologia de córneas assimétricas para melhorar uma centralização, uma adaptação mais confortável. O acabamento periférico tórico, elevação de borda em padrões específicos, e a face posterior tórica, que muita gente não desconhece um pouco esse desenho, que de fato melhora também muito a adaptação. Com relação ao acabamento de bordas, o professor Porroso falou, mas vale destacar As lentes Rosicá 2 e a Rosicá NC, a gente tem 3 tipos de acabamentos principais de borda, a standard, a elevada e a reduzida. Obviamente que lentes de diâmetros menores eu vou encontrar pouca necessidade de variação dessa borda, né? Então eu não preciso ter uma variação tão grande. Agora, à medida que eu aumento o diâmetro das lentes, como na Rosicá IC e PG, obviamente eu vou estar apoiando essa lente numa porção mais plana da córnea, uma média periferia, de maneira que eu preciso encontrar numa combinação entre centro e periferia uma maior variação de periférica. Então eu encontro aqui 5 padrões de periférica, né? A padrão, a elevada, a duplamente elevada, a reduzida e a duplamente reduzida. Então isso para a gente é mágica, né? De maneira que a gente consegue brincar com essa adaptação e fazer uma adaptação variando esses parâmetros mais anatômica para esse paciente, permitindo conforto, visão, centralização. Bom, enfim, também, como eu disse, tem regras não muito eficazes para a escolha da curva base da lente de teste. Optamos por começar com uma lente de 8/20, né, tentando evitar um aperto excessivo, que pudesse modificar um pouco essa córnea a ponto de ter que remarcar um teste, enfim. E, obviamente, com a lente de 8/20, dando um toque, né, indesejável, sobrando um pouco a periférica. Lembrando que no passo a passo, primeiro a gente concentra na curva base, depois fazer a avaliação dos outros parâmetros para melhorar. Insatisfeito com essa curva base, apertei bastante essa lente, né, em 0,4. Melhora um pouco o padrão central, mas mesmo assim ainda insatisfeito, gerando um toque no arco do anel ali, que está me incomodando um pouco. Aperto ainda mais essa lente. Essa lente melhora bastante o padrão central, perco um pouco do perfil periférico dessa lente, né? Essa lente começa a apertar um pouco mais, mas lembra que eu estou escolhendo a curva base, porque isso eu sei que eu posso variar e combinar. Para encurtar um pouco o caso, não ficar mostrando todos os exemplos dessas lentes, eu apertei ainda um pouco mais essa curva base, variei um pouco a periférica, coloquei uma lente com a periférica duplamente elevada, uma vez que a minha 760 já estava com uma periférica um pouco faltando. Se eu aperto a minha curva base na 740, a minha expectativa é que eu tenho ainda menos periférica, então eu testei a lente com a periférica duplamente elevada e encontrei um padrão extremamente bom, né, diante da irregularidade da córnea do paciente, permitindo uma boa troca lacrimal. Aqui um acúmulo que não me incomodou, vou testar, vejo um funcionamento de bomba lacrimal muito eficiente, ou seja, uma periférica que na dinâmica do piscar ela me apresenta um padrão bem bom, bem satisfatório. Uma lente bem centralizada também, à medida do possível, né? Temos uma irregularidade inferior e essa lente tem a tendência a buscar o ápice dessa irregularidade, mas o paciente ficou, de fato, extremamente satisfeito. Nós vamos ver no final o resultado. No olho esquerdo, eu tenho um padrão bem similar ao do olho direito. Inicio com uma lente com essa curvatura, que, de fato, eu não gostei. Eu preciso pensar em apertar um pouco mais essa lente. Mudo para uma 760. Né? Essa lente sobra muito, dá um toque central aqui bem significativo, né? E uma elevação de borda inferior, principalmente, também, que não está me deixando confortável, nem um pouco satisfeito. Aperto essa lente um pouco mais, tem uma certa melhora dessa troca lacrimal, aqui, principalmente no padrão central, né? Mas também ainda um pouco aquém. Eu costumo balizar muito meu teste, ou seja, se eu estou encontrando uma lente plana, eu tento ser um pouco mais agressivo no aperto, para que eu possa balizar um pouco, né? Se eu estou vendo uma lente plana e encontro uma lente de curva base apertada, eu sei que eu estou mais ou menos naquele meio do caminho. Então, eu mudei para uma lente 720, né? Embora essa lente tenha uma troca lacrimal bem prejudicada, exatamente porque eu não tenho uma elevação de periférica satisfatória, eu melhoro um pouco o meu padrão central. Obviamente que aqui não está entrando muita fluoresceína, comprometendo um pouco essa minha avaliação. Então, eu faço o teste, dou uma recuada na minha curva base, porque eu achei esse aperto um pouco excessivo, e, coincidentemente, terminei também numa lente 740, com a periférica duplamente elevada, né? Essa é a avaliação do olho esquerdo, de maneira que eu fiquei muito satisfeito com essa adaptação. O paciente também, essa lente ficou melhor centralizada do que a do direito, e na dinâmica eu vejo uma periférica bem funcionante, né? Ou seja, dando conforto ao paciente. Qual a função da periférica? Dar conforto, permitir essa renovação lacrimal. Então, eu vejo, de fato, uma lente com uma boa mobilidade, uma boa centralização, uma periférica 360 graus, uma adaptação que, de fato, se demonstrou muito segura para mim. Quando a gente avalia esses dois olhos, uma avaliação final, paciente 20/20 de visão, consegui, inclusive, contornar o caso de insatisfação dele com o colega, né? Ele entende que cirurgia geralmente tem resultados que nem sempre são previsíveis. e de fato o paciente ficou muito satisfeito com a visão de 20/20, e este foi o nosso caso, que se a gente de fato não tivesse uma lente dessa na mão, com tantos recursos, a gente teria muita dificuldade de encontrar uma adaptação que pudesse satisfazer tanto o paciente do ponto de vista visual, quanto também a gente na questão do respeito à fisiologia corneana. Então, vale lembrar que foi um caso indicado uma lente escleral. Obviamente que esse paciente não passou por um teste eficiente de lente corneana. Esse paciente teria totais condições de se adaptar com uma lente corneana, como de fato se adaptou. 29 anos, provavelmente um usuário de lente de contato para o resto da sua vida. Então, muito melhor para ele que a gente faça a adaptação de uma lente mais saudável, mais respeitosa. Bom, enfim, era isso que eu queria trazer para vocês, sempre lembrando a figura com muita saudade do meu pai, que era um grande amigo e admirador do Paul Rose também, de maneira que eu sempre presto essa homenagem a quem eu devo tudo. Muito obrigado a vocês aí pela lembrança, espero ter contribuído com todos aí com a discussão desse caso.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Godinho. Me lembro mucho, un buen homenaje. Muy obrigado. Bien, Marcelo, ahora vamos. Bueno, yo pienso que está todo bien, ¿no? Marcelo?
Sí. Sí, hola, Juan.
Ok. Bueno, muito obrigado a todo. Thank you very much to all attendees and the speakers, and Dr. Paul, Marcelo, Suarez, Dr. Godinho. I would like to mention as well the Menicon, that thanks to them it's possible, this organization. So thank you very much, everyone. And also special thanks to the Cristiano that with Norma, and the Menicon team, Patricia and Jennifer, we built this event for tonight. And also I would like to thank you very much to Dr. Tania, and it was a pleasure to see her again, and I hope to see her soon. And well, I think that's all for tonight. Let me remember that after this meeting, by tomorrow, we will share with you the presentation. If you would like to check again some slides that Mr. Paul made tonight presentation, and also we are going to share with you the presentation in Portuguese language. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again in the new contact lens event. And Marcelo, te dejo a vos para despedir a todo el mundo.
Muito obrigado, Juan.
Sí. Déjame, Jennifer, you would like also to mention something?
I just wanted to say on behalf of Menicon, thank you. First of all, hello, konnichiwa, and arigato gozaimasu. Thank you all very much for attending. It's always a pleasure. And just to thank you to Mediphacos, Marcelo and the team, you guys have been incredibly wonderful partners for Rose K. So it's truly an honor for Menicon to be working with such an incredible group like Mediphacos, and especially to be working with an incredible group of doctors like yourselves who understand how important it is to fit these patients properly. So we appreciate you taking the time to learn how to fit these, especially from Paul. So thank you, Paul, again, for always your time in sharing your knowledge with us. So I hope everyone stays safe, and thank you to everyone who had organized this meeting for us.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Let's listen Paul to say thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much for attending. Obrigado. I'm sure that means thank you. Is that right?
It's perfect.
Thank you all for attending. I do hope you've learned something today, and hopefully one day I'll get across to Brazil again rather than have to present this as a webinar. Thank you, Marcelo, for putting this together with Menicon. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to Menicon for making this webinar possible. Muito obrigado a todos os nossos participantes dessa noite e boa noite a todos.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, Norma.
Bye. Thank you.